me that this is being recorded and we will archive it, just as we did our last webinar on logic models. You can request it from me. It'll be posted on the link will be posted on the network website. And I think, if I remember right, this technology actually sends it to you if you've registered, which everybody here has done that. As a reminder, if the audio is poor at your end, and if you like using this technique of learning, you might consider investing in a pair of a set of headsets. We found that they were pretty inexpensive. I think we paid $24 or something for them, and so we found it to be a really good investment. Sometimes it's really hard to hear through the computer, or you can't be heard. So if it's something you like, you might want to consider investing in a headset. Lynn has included a couple of polls in her slides, so I'll be helping her administer those. Those are questions that we're going to ask you, and that will help keep you engaged as well as help us understand who we're talking to and some of your experiences. I think that is it as far as logistics. If you have any questions as we go along about if you can't hear or if there's some problem at your end you want us to deal with, by all means ask the question. It just comes to me. Nobody else sees the question. So I think that's it. We'll have to end right at 11 because Lynn has another meeting. And so if there are follow-up questions, Lynn has her email address at the end. I think it's on your last slide, Lynn. I'm going to turn my camera off, and it'll be Lynn, and you can leave yours on or not, Lynn. It's up to you if you want to show your slides or what have you. But okay, I'm going to hand it over to you, Lynn.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Bear with me. This is my first webinar, so we'll see how this goes. Many of you have probably seen these slides in some form before, but with the new OWEB insurance requirements, it seemed like an appropriate time to go back to some of those old slides and kind of refresh them in terms of the OWEB insurance requirements. So we're going to weave those requirements throughout the slide as we move along. As Sean mentioned, feel free to ask questions as we go along. And I have some resources at the end that we'll talk about. There are many more slides here than we'll have time to cover this morning, but you'll see as we move through this, this program this morning that they are meant to be helpful to you in terms of the risk management solutions along with the insurance solutions side by side for each kind of grant project or project that you might be considering. So with that, our agenda this morning, we're going to discuss the concepts of risk management. We're going to discuss the ways in which risk management techniques can protect your council and district. We're also going to discuss the new OWEB insurance requirements effective January 1. And of course, I think Courtney has another upcoming webinar on the 7th of December that you might want to consider joining. And how and where the risk management and the OWEB requirements intersect. And at the end, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to talk about some available resources as well. So what is risk management? The definition is the process by which organizations evaluate and assess uncertain but potential future loss events. What we're really talking about is managing uncertainty. This protects your reputation and mission. It protects people, it protects property, protects public, and certainly in your case, it also protects the environment. What makes sense for your council or district? We evaluate risk every day. We may decide to drive 5 to 7 miles faster to get to our destination. We are making a risk assessment at that point to say, gee, I think I can do this without getting a ticket. So we do evaluate risk every day. We may not think of it in terms of risk management, but really that's kind of what you're doing at the end of the day. Often we don't take adequate time to address risk in some of the hazards in relation to our small and large grant projects. As we move forward, OWEB with certain types of projects will require you to look and identify risk as well as mitigate risk, and also complete this DAS risk assessment form that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So where do we start to start managing uncertainty? There are several components to risk management. One is to identify the risk. Second is to qualify the risk. And here we're talking about the probability of risk, not Chicken Little, the sky is falling, but what is really probable as opposed to possible. We're going to focus this morning on managing risk. There are 4 elements to managing risk. Avoidance. Do we have the resources and expertise to take on the identified risk? We're going to heavily concentrate some of our talk this morning on transfer of risk, and in short, or the insurance vernacular that we use, we flip that and we call it risk transfer. There are 2 methods of risk transfer: contractual relationships and insurance. And then we're also going to discuss risk mitigation, policy and procedure that you can put in place to reduce the potential of risk. And finally, acceptance of risk. We all know that that subduction earthquake may occur in the future. Have we thought about some contingency plans associated with that risk? A couple other things is to regularly monitor risk. And so at this point, I kind of want to get a sense from all of you in terms of if you have a structure in place. So I'm going to ask Sean to come in here and ask a poll question. Sean?
Yeah, looks like the votes are coming in.
Okay.
Everyone can see, if you're on the phone, maybe you can't see the question, of course. Does your council or district currently have a framework in place to evaluate risk? So it looks like about 3/4 of you have voted, and I'm going to say that 41% of you said no, 35% of you said yes, and 24% of you said that you weren't sure.
All right. So it sounds like we have some work ahead of us, and that this risk management is something that we should really be talking about here. So let's talk about avoidance. Again, this is really what it means. Can you eliminate the risk entirely? Some examples of avoidance of risk are maybe a city or school elects not to hold a particular event because of the risk associated with that activity. A watershed elects not to have an outdoor school due to the inherent risk associated with dealing with minor children. They simply don't have the resources to do that effectively and safely. Or a manufacturer elects not to make a part that's integral to the operation of an aircraft. There's special insurance, and let me tell you, it's really expensive when you get into that realm. So that manufacturer has decided not to make that particular part. Or a nonprofit organization makes the decision to cancel a fireworks display due to the high fire danger. Those are examples of avoidance of risk. You may come up with some additional examples as well. Transfer of risk. There are 2 methods of transfer of risk, and we're going to spend quite a lot of time on this because this is an important feature of what you do. There's the contractual relationships with contractors or independent contractors, and there's the purchase of insurance. That's another form of risk transfer. We're going to start first in talking about those important elements regarding risk transfer related to contracts. This is something that all councils and districts enter into, and it's really one of the most important functions as an executive director, coordinator, of your council or district. We're going to talk about what I think you should always do, and then we're going to talk about the real world as well. First of all, you should always have a contract between parties. And again, I'm an insurance agent, so that's what I'm going to tell you to do. If you give me a call, I'm going to tell you always to have a contract. Always require specific insurance limits. Always require an additional insured endorsement for both ongoing operations and completed operations. And if there is an exposure to pollution liability, you want that additional insured endorsement to apply to that line of coverage as well. Most policies will automatically give an additional insured ongoing operations. They don't always provide completed operations coverage in that additional insured endorsement. Usually the underwriter at an insurance company may want to ask some additional underwriting questions to extend that additional insured endorsement to completed operations. The only way you're going to know if you have both is when you get that certificate of insurance, that you also get the supporting endorsement. They're hard to read, so sometimes it's difficult to ferret out whether or not you have both ongoing operations extended to you as the additional insured and completed operations. Your insurance agent should be able to help you ferret that out quite quickly because they see these documents all the time. So don't be afraid to engage your insurance agent at that point as well. You should always require workers' compensation coverage before the start of the project. This is really important when it comes to contracts when you're it's a contractor out there working in the field. You don't want to inadvertently pick up potential workers' comp exposure, so you want to make sure that that contractor has workers' comp coverage in place before that project starts. Always require a waiver of subrogation. Every policy that the insurance company has the right to subrogate against a party that is negligent or caused the bodily injury to a third party or property damage. You want to waive that. You have a contractual relationship with that person, so it's not uncommon to request that waiver of subrogation for both general liability and workers' comp. Always require the other party's insurance coverage to be primary. Who's on first? If a claim does occur, hopefully it never does, but if it does, you want to make sure that their coverage is going to pay first. And also very important is this notion of an indemnification and hold harmless clause. That should be contained in that contract as well. I'm going to go through another couple of slides and then I'll open it up for questions because I know this area has causes a lot of angst with many of you. The transfer of risk, if there's a professional liability type exposure in place, someone is a licensed engineer, you should also require that party to have professional liability coverage. You don't need an additional insured endorsement for professional liability. That's not a common practice, so just proof of coverage that that party has professional liability is sufficient. And sometimes it's worth the money to spend to have an attorney review those contracts. I am not an attorney. I do review a lot of contracts for my clients, but my review is limited to those insurance requirements, and it's a valuable process to go through. So engage both of those professionals in your contracts. Insurance is another form of risk transfer, and again, we get back to, do you have sufficient limits? Do you have property coverage? Do you have specialty coverage that's needed for a particular project? And we're going to get into this a little later when we look at the DAS risk assessment form. What does it mean to require that a subcontractor name the council or district as an additional insured? Many of you know what that means, but I thought it's important for those that may not, is to cover that ground. An additional insured really is a special status on the insurance policy. It basically means that that contractor or that independent contractor's insurance policy is going to come in to protect the council or the district, and it will provide costs to defend the council or the district if there is a lawsuit. In short, that's what that means. So it's very important to make sure that the coverage that you required in your contract, that the contractor really has met those insurance requirements. It also may provide and extend important coverage that a council or district doesn't have. For example, pollution liability. Most general liability policies have an absolute pollution exclusion. So if you enter into a project where there is pollution liability is going to be required, then you also want to make sure that that coverage is in place, and it's sometimes not very easy to ferret out. It takes some work on your part. Also remember that the contractual risk transfer is a common process. No one is going to think that you're asking for an outrageous level of insurance. This is a very common practice done day to day. I review many contracts for not only the councils, but for many of my other clients as well. The process of transferring risk and the protection this provides your council is only as good as the contract developed prior to the start of the job and the diligence in making sure the contractor complies with all insurance requirements set forth in that contract. I'm going to stop here. Do we have any questions? This is a big topic that I deal with daily with just about all of my clients.
We'll wait just a second to see if there's any questions. And there may be something that people want Lynn to just go over again. So feel free to just request a point to be made again or to define a term.
Okay. Either that or you are all very shy. This is a very challenging topic. One of the questions, I'll just ask myself a question that we get all the time is, I've hired this professional, he's going to provide some consulting services for the council, and I sent him a contract and he tells me he doesn't have any insurance. What do I do? Can I still hire this person? As your agent, I'm never going to tell you that you can't do something. But I would urge you to have a framework to make sure that you have a standard contract in place, that you always follow these requirements. But in certain circumstances in the real world, you may look at the risk and say, the risk really isn't that great. And so we've made the decision as the executive director and board maybe to waive those insurance requirements for certain situations. That should be only on an occasional basis, in my opinion, but that's something that you can do. You're basically making a business decision at that juncture. That's one question that comes up a lot. Okay, moving on.
There is a question, Lynn,
Sure.
from Rob. Will the certificate of insurance tell us if the waiver of subrogation is in place? Or is that identified in our contract with the service provider?
It should be in your contract, first of all, because all of this is predicated on a contract. But there is a box, and it's on the certificate says SUBROWVD, waived. So there is a little box that's checked. What I might do after this is give you all a sample certificate that you might wish to consider, and you'll see that on that certificate of insurance. But there is a box that can be checked that shows you that both general liability and workers' comp, that there's a waiver of subrogation.
And another question, Lynn, should councils always require the same minimum insurance requirements for contractors, regardless of the level of risk involved?
Not always. It depends. And when we get to the risk assessment form that will now be required for certain activities, you should certainly have your standard limits, which are $1 million per occurrence for commercial general liability and $2 million aggregate limit. But as we move through this process, there are certain activities where that assessment form may require that that contractor have greater limits of insurance. It will be dependent upon the risks associated with that particular job or grant, and you as the council or district are going to be able to go through that and evaluate that risk. Does that answer the question? Insurance doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover your staff time. It doesn't cover the momentum of the program or the mission. It doesn't cover reputational loss. As we've talked about, OWEB will require completion of a risk assessment form for certain activities. This form is designed to do a couple of things. It will determine whether the council or district's insurance coverage is appropriate, or if you need additional lines of coverage. It will also give you guidance in terms of whether or not you have sufficient limits for both the council and the contractor. And that gets back to that earlier question.
Rob, I think that was your question. I'm going to just unmute you and see if there's anything else you want to ask or if that did it.
I think that answered it. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Rob.
And Deb, I'm going to unmute you to make sure that we got your question answered. Go ahead.
Yes, we got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Good. Excellent. So let's talk about risk mitigation. This really gets to the heart of policy and procedure that the council or district puts in place to reduce the potential of risk. These kinds of things are safety policies for workplace injury, employment policy that deals with the management of employees in terms of hiring, firing, and discipline, abuse policies that put a framework in place to report incidents of sexual abuse to minor children, procedures in place to make sure that contracts and risk transfer measures are always followed. I highly recommend that if you don't have a framework in place for this, that you do develop some kind of checklist to make sure that certain measures are always followed and within an established protocol. And then it also allows you the flexibility in certain rare circumstances where you may not require those insurance requirements. And then a process of annual review. So you capture any new and emerging risks like cyber liability and drones. Believe it or not, if you do have a drone and you're using a drone for council or district business, you need to make sure that your insurance policy has some liability coverage for that, because a drone is considered an aircraft and they're typically excluded. So engage your insurance agent in an annual review. Ask about available risk management resources. There are some great tools out there for everyone to use. Most of you likely have your workers' comp coverage with SAFE, for example. And even if you don't, safe.com, there's a whole bunch of safety policy training tools that are available on that website. Other insurance carriers have similar tools related to employment practices issues, as well as general liability issues, and policy, sample policy and procedure for abuse coverage, abuse and molestation dealing with minor children. If you are a licensed engineer and have professional liability coverage, usually for those types of risks, there's also contract review available through those. For the rest of you, for a council or district, you're stuck usually with your agent and your attorney for contract review. Again, your best resource is going to be your agent regarding new and emerging risks, as well as any questions. If you have a question regarding a contract or a particular activity, the best thing to do is to pick up your agent and have pick up the phone and call your agent and have a discussion. Acceptance of risk. We know that there are some things that are going to happen. A natural disaster. Even at WSC Insurance several years ago, we had a disaster here and had, feet of water in the building. It was raining inside the building, basically. So we put in place our plan and our contingency plans in that particular situation. We had a phone tree. So certain individuals were required to call others, so forth and so on. We also had a person that was designated to interface with the media and public. You want to do this in advance before anything happens. Hopefully nothing will happen, but it's good to have that in place before, so you're not scrambling to figure out who's allowed to talk with the media and the public. An alternate location for operations. Many of you could probably work out of your home. That's true for most of us these days with these wonderful tools we have. And what tools and resources will you need to put that contingency plan in place? When we get to the point of assessing risk, I am not going to take credit for these. These key questions really come from that DAS risk assessment tool. But I thought that they were good questions. I've augmented those to include some of the OWEB insurance requirements as well. So when you are evaluating a risk, some of the key questions that you might ask is, what is the scope of the contracted activity or program? What functions are necessary to deliver or accomplish this activity or service? When and where will the service or activity take place? Who will perform the service or activity? Will the contractor have interactions with others, the public or staff? Will there be any hazardous materials, earth moving, work near wetlands, water, or endangered species? Has your standard request for proposal changed to meet the new OWEB insurance requirements? And Sean, I think we have another poll question here.
Yeah, it's about how people feel their organization is currently ready with OWEB insurance requirements. And by the way, this is an anonymous survey, so.
Yeah, I don't see how you answer at all.
Okay. Just about 3/4 of you have voted so far. And that might be about it. All right. So I'm going to close the survey and I'm going to share it this time. So look at 3/4 of you have some confidence, and
Wow.
none of you say not at all. So
that is great. Well, I think Courtney has done a great job in getting the word out in terms of the OWEB insurance requirements. So most of you have had a question. We're going to kind of dive right in here. The new OWEB insurance requirements, the minimum is certainly general liability at $1 million per occurrence and $2 million aggregate limit. and this is where all grantees receiving project funds from OWEB, regardless of the type or complexity of the project, and auto liability of $1 million combined single limit. So most of my councils are going to have certainly that level of coverage and more. There are other insurance requirements that OWEB has not made, has not specifically required of you, but are equally important. There's directors and officers liability, which protects the nonprofit organization and the board. Workers' compensation coverage. If you have any employees, it protects your employee from injury on the job. And that is required by the state of Oregon if you have any W-2 employees. And then property coverage. Most of you will have some minor property coverage, although that is optional coverage for you as well.
Lynn,
Yes.
got a question. Wondering about how this dictates other grants that are non-OWEB, or doesn't it apply? We have best management practices in place as well as fairly good coverage. I also checked in with an insurance agent already.
It's always, regardless of what these OWEB, I think, has put a good, let me put it this way, OWEB has put a good framework in place for you. It is easier to have a standard procedure and follow one procedure, although you are not required under those privately funded projects to meet the OWEB insurance requirements. Is it a good idea to do so? Absolutely. These insurance requirements are not outlandish, in my opinion. They are fairly standard. Most of you should have most of these insurance requirements, with a couple of exceptions that I'll get into on this page. Does that answer that that person's question?
I'm going to unmute that person. Kelly, does that answer it? I see you have another question too. Not sure if she can hear us. The other question Kelly had was, if I'm working with kids in any way on a non-OWEB grant, does it apply to my council support grant since I'm participating under my grant?
I think that it would. That might be a Courtney question here, but my sense is that that would. And even though it may not be something that is an OWEB grant funded project, it's still a very good idea to have abuse or molestation coverage. That protects your board, period. That's my feeling.
Yeah. She says, I think I'm satisfied with the answer. Thanks.
Okay, great. So let's look at some of the other OWEB insurance requirements beyond the minimum. Pesticide and herbicide applicator limited pollution coverage of 500 per occurrence and 1 million aggregate limit. This is for all grant projects when the grantee employees are applying pesticide and herbicides. In most cases, you're contracting, most councils and districts are contracting this out with a licensed contractor. And in that case, what you need to do is make certain that your contractor has that level of coverage. If you have employees doing this, or the grantee in this case, then yes, you need to obtain this coverage. But that is usually rare in my experience. Professional liability, 500,000 per occurrence, $1 million aggregate limit. Again, this applies to grantee employees who have a professional license. Again, in my experience, I don't know of any council or district that has, say, a licensed engineer on staff where you would need this coverage. Again, if you do have a professional services agreement with an engineer, we go back to that contract, and I would recommend that you require that engineer to have their own professional liability insurance.
Lynn?
Yes.
Courtney is doesn't have a microphone, so she just wrote me a note. She said only the minimum insurance requirements will apply for operating capacity grants. OWEB cannot put requirements on activities funded through other grants or other funds.
Absolutely. That I thought that that would be her answer. But again, is it a good idea? The next question is it a good idea to make sure you have this coverage? And I would have that conversation with your insurance agent, actually. The last one, abuse or molestation. Most councils and districts have interaction with minor children either in the school district. Some even have their own outdoor school or camps in the summer. My sense is because of the level of interaction with minor children that all councils and districts should have this coverage to protect your board. For in most cases, it's not a lot of additional premium involved in getting this minimal coverage. And what it does is it protects the board if there's any allegation of abuse coming from a minor child. They're going to come in, the policy will come in and defend the board and the council and the district. So it's an important coverage, I think, for everyone to explore. I would put that on your must-have list of insurance, but again, have that discussion with your insurance agent. A lot is dependent upon the activity that that council or district has with minor children. Most of you have quite a lot, actually. Here's where it gets interesting, is under certain activities, OWEB will require that you complete the risk assessment form. I'm just going to read these. Working with hazardous materials, not including materials used in the normal operation of equipment such as hydraulic fluid, earth moving work around the footprint of a well, aerial application of chemicals, transporting individuals on the water. This could include that fundraising event done annually where you're taking folks on a canoe trip. And then removal or alteration of structures that hold back water on land or in stream, including dams, levees, dikes, tide gates, and other water control devices. This does not include temporary diversion dams used solely to divert water for irrigation. I actually looked at this DAS assessment, risk assessment tool, and Courtney and I had a conversation about it. Any activity on table 3 is going to require this assessment tool. Once you complete this assessment tool and and it indicates that there's no need for additional insurance, then no additional action is needed. If the risk assessment tool, however, shows additional insurance is needed beyond the standard requirements, this will compel the purchase of additional insurance by the council or the contractor. In most cases, this is going to apply to the contractor. So when I looked at this particular assessment tool, in light of some of the activities my councils have engaged in, I found it to be a little bit of a challenge. Some of the examples given are not specific to the work that a council or district would engage in. So I would suggest that you give Courtney your constructive feedback as you work with this tool. It's not perfect. It is an assessment tool that gets you to and will perhaps answer some of the questions we've struggled with in the past about additional insurance levels. So I would suggest, again, giving your constructive feedback to Courtney, perhaps even taking a prior grant project that fits this category and running it through just to become familiar with the risk assessment tool itself, and then asking Courtney any questions that you might have. But it's not, again, a perfect tool. Oops. Again, just to reiterate, this assessment tool is now required for any activity in Table 3. So what ultimately makes sense for your risk assessment roadmap? Again, as I've mentioned, the risk assessment tool isn't perfect. There are a lot of other assessment tools out there, but OWEB will require for those OWEB funded projects to use that assessment tool for any activity listed in Table 3. Who should be involved in the assessment project? Certainly key individuals, your executive director, board members, perhaps even pull your insurance agent in. They will have some good ideas. And in certain circumstances, your attorney, particularly on a contract. I have several slides here. We're not going to get through all of these, but I wanted to kind of look side by side. What are the insurance solutions for a particular type of project, and what are the risk management solutions? This is not a full list. You may think of other ideas that I haven't thought of with each one of these, but I want you to know that insurance doesn't cover everything, and that you really need to engage the risk management process on some of these projects. For a large grant project, you're going to need probably that risk assessment tool. You're going to need to complete that, and that will guide you through the process. On the risk management side, you're going to need engineering, you're going to need permits and signed permissions from landowners. Contracts and additional insured certificates, we've talked about those. Risk assessment of the site, who has access? Do you need any additional sign posting for to keep the public safe? And employee safety. Does your, sometimes maybe you need to have a short safety meeting before people go out into the field in a particular project. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the DAS risk assessment tool will likely be required. On the insurance side, commercial general liability. Are the limits sufficient? Again, the assessment tool is going to help you with that, but just because you might get to a place where it doesn't require you to have any additional insurance, it doesn't mean that you as the executive director and board can't make the decision for a particular project to require higher limits of insurance from that contractor. Some of these projects are large. So in some cases you might want to consider a performance bond, and that would be something that the contractor would have to purchase that protects the value, the total value of that project and the completion of the project. Loggers broad form is a specialty endorsement on a general liability policy, and the loggers broad form basically protects the forest from fires and so forth and so on. That may be something that is required as well. Pollution liability. This is a specialty policy. It is expensive. So if, and I should note that the pollution liability, the limited pollution liability is the only pollution liability that OWEB is requiring at this juncture. But you may need to require pollution liability on some of these larger projects of your contractor. And that's not something that we've talked a lot about in the past. Workers' comp, who is managing the project? Who's going to go out there? Do you have a certificate of insurance from the contractor, making sure that they have workers' comp insurance? Here's a small grant project, something like tree planting. Again, you're going to need landowner permissions on the risk management side, contracts and additional insured certificates with any subcontractors. Risk assessment of the site. You're going to see some similarities here as we move through the slides. Employee safety in a safety handbook. We have samples here. If you don't have anything, we can certainly get you started in that direction. Volunteer safety. Oftentimes you're going to have volunteers out there planting those trees. I would encourage all volunteers to sign a waiver form, but also you need to look at volunteers just as you would any employees. You need to keep them safe as well. They're an important aspect of what councils and districts do. And the pesticide herbicide application, again, if it's the DAS assessment tool is going to help you there. That will be required if there's any aerial spraying. On the insurance side, again, you're going to see some familiar themes. Commercial general liability, are the limits sufficient? Pesticide herbicide applicators, do they have a license? Do you have the limited pollution liability coverage? I am looking into, for some of my other councils, trying to see if we can't get some kind of endorsement on their current policy for the limited pollution liability. So too early to give you a final word on that, but that's hopefully something that we can consider in the future for councils. And a volunteer handbook. Again, I have a sample volunteer handbook that you might wish to consider, and an accident policy for your volunteers. This does several things. It keeps that valuable group of volunteers safe, gives them some coverage for an accident that could be on that work site. And it also protects your general liability policy. A volunteer accident policy is very inexpensive, probably anywhere from $350 to $500. So it's a very inexpensive tool. And then again, workers' comp, who is managing the project. Driving exposure, this is another big area that we see a lot of risk. And I know some councils and districts have just a handful of employees, others have more than a handful. So you want to know who is driving company vehicles and even create an authorized list. Who is using personal vehicles for business purposes, and I would again create another list. Were motor vehicle records checked at the time of hire and found to be acceptable? Acceptable is an insurance term. Not all insurance companies agree on what is an acceptable driving record, and I could provide some guidance on that as well. Do you have motor vehicle records been checked regularly since the time of hire? What about 5 years later? Are you still looking at those motor vehicle records on a regular basis, maybe every other year? Some do it every year, some do it every other year. There's also a very inexpensive risk management tool that we recommend called the Automated Reporting System with Oregon Department of Motor Vehicles. You can actually pay a small fee of $75, and DMV will alert you of any change in your employee's driving record and give you an opportunity to counsel that employee before the insurance company says, sorry, we're not going to insure that person anymore. On the insurance side, commercial auto liability, again, that's something that's going to be required by OWEB. Sufficient limits corresponding with the exposure. Again, $1 million is typically sufficient unless you have a lot of vehicles out there on the road. Then I might recommend an umbrella policy, which is the next item, of course. And then discussion about that level of risk with your insurance agent. That's something, again, that should be included in your annual review.
Hey, Lynn, I'm just going to
Yes.
jump in. It's 5 minutes to 11. I don't know if there are going to be more questions or that people are going to want to see your email address. I know, and you have that on your last slide.
Absolutely. Let's just move. All of these others, feel free. I include topics about volunteers, outdoor school, minor children, premises and property, special events. That's another big one. I'd take a look at that. Professional liability exposures, employee safety, protecting the board, and the mission of the council and district. And finally, some resources. I mentioned earlier that safe.com is a great resource for employee safety. They also have what they call a safety culture spectrum that identifies where you're at in the risk management process. You can pull that up on their website. They have some great online tools and resources. I've also included a link to the DAS risk assessment form. I would encourage all of you, I know time is always valuable and limited, but take one of your larger projects that fit Table 3 and go through and look at that risk assessment form. Give Courtney your constructive feedback. We know that it's not a perfect tool, but at least it will help start the dialogue in the process. SDIO, the districts are going to have their insurance predominantly with SDIO. They have some great resources on their website. They have a library to include manuals, and they have also a good section on risk management. So take a look at that if you are a district and you haven't seen that section before. Oregon OSHA is also a very good website. They have an A to Z topic list. I'm in there all the time. They also have some great fact sheets. So look at the fact sheets rather than pulling up a 120-page manual, because the fact sheets at least give you a thumbnail sketch of what you need to do or are required to do from a workers' comp standpoint. And then again, your insurance agent, give them a call. And here is my email address and my telephone number. Feel free to email me with a question or even pick up the phone and give me a call. I will get back to you as soon as I'm able. Oftentimes on these complicated questions concerning contracts and contractual risk transfer, sometimes it's best to pick up the phone, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that the group might have.
That's great. And I'll just look and see if there are any last questions. I have a question if, oops, I got a thank you from somebody, from Kelly. Lynn, while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, you've made a couple of references to talking to your insurance agent, and I'm not sure how many people have an insurance agent that they trust and know well. I mean, insurance agents are in the business of selling insurance, so there's always this sense of, am I getting the Cadillac when I really just need a Chevy? So what are the guidelines for choosing an insurance agent?
An insurance agent, certainly, they're going to sell you a policy all day long. And it's a fine balance of insurance and risk management. You really want to have an insurance agent that will also give you the tools, the risk management tools that you might need. That is an important key feature. I think that's how WSC stands out among insurance agents, is we work very closely with our clients regardless of their premium size to give them the tools that they need on the risk management side. We know that insurance isn't the only thing that can protect a council or district. You really need to have those risk management tools for that holistic approach.
Great, thank you. There was another comment. I was an insurance agent in a past life. Make sure you can talk openly and honestly with that person when he or she provides you with an education but lets you make the insurance purchase decision. Then you're in the right hands. Very good comment. Yeah.
Very good comment.
Yeah.
I agree.
I should let folks know how is it that we ended up talking to you today, Lynn. I think it was an organic process. In April, I think, April Obrick, you were maybe the first one out of the gate to contact Lynn because she's there in Forest Grove where you are, close to there. And Lynn just started learning about the needs of watershed councils And one by one, Lynn, you just started amassing the Watershed Council troop and got yourself very familiar with OWEB's requirements and so on. So thank you for the homework that you did to prepare for this, Lynn, and the knowledge that you carry. We know you're not the only insurance agent, and if every council and district went to you, you wouldn't be able to take everybody anyway. So we really appreciate your honest assessment, honest description of what's needed. So
You are so welcome.
I'm gonna look just one more time to see if there's any hands up or any more questions before we let Lynn off the hook here. Just a reminder that there's a brief survey at the end. Again, we really appreciate your feedback on these events and future topics. And as a reminder that this has been recorded and will be archived and available on the network's website, or you can also email me at sean@oregonwatersheds.org to have me email you the recording straight away if you want to send it to somebody else or listen to it again. So, all right, I don't see any other questions, Lynn, so whoops, there's one. Are the slides available? Yes, they are. I thought there was an icon on your screen, everybody, that allows you to have the handouts, but I've had a couple of questions about that, so maybe it's not as obvious as I thought. Oh yeah, Kelly says you can download them directly. Since I'm not on the receiving end of this, I haven't seen what the screen looks like. It is under the handouts just above the chat bar. Thanks, Kelly, for that. So you can download the PowerPoint and also the OWEB requirements if you haven't seen that yet. So somebody says, I tried the link, but it says it's not available. Okay, Jenny, I will email you. I just downloaded it, somebody said. Anyway, if you're having trouble getting the PowerPoint, email me, I guess is the best way to, or email Lynn and she'll ship it to you. So
absolutely. And aren't you, Sean, going to post this on the network's website?
Yes, I will post the PowerPoint and the recording. Yeah, good point. Great. All right, everyone, thank you. And Lynn,
thank you so much.
Thank you to you as well. And we'll see you at the next webinar.
You bet. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.